Welcome to Illustrator Ink and Paint. This class is all about creating and using calligraphic brushes and working with the Wacom tablet in Illustrator. Calligraphic brushes are really the go-to brush type for freehand drawing with expressive line work in Illustrator. And since version CS4 introduced the Blob Brush, calligraphic brushes have become really useful for coloring and even creating freehand shapes. So we'll look at how to create custom calligraphic brush tips from scratch, and most importantly, we'll be using the brushes we create to ink and color some artwork. I'll provide the art for tracing, and I'll guide you through the process so you'll have the chance to really get the feel for what you can do with these brushes by getting absorbed in a project. And you'll have a piece of finished artwork that you can use in your own personal projects. There are 5 different types of brushes in Adobe Illustrator depending on which version you're working in. There are calligraphic brushes, art brushes, pattern brushes, and scatter brushes. And in CS5, bristle brushes were introduced. One thing they all share in common is that they live in the Brushes panel, and they all behave like interchangeable pen tips that can be used with the Paintbrush tool. In this class, we're focusing on calligraphic brushes, and the primary Illustrator tools for drawing with these brushes are the Paintbrush tool and the Blob Brush. And you'll get the most out of these tools when you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet like a Wacom. A tablet gives me the most natural control over my line work, and it gives me the pressure sensitivity option that you can't get with a mouse. You can certainly create all the brushes we make in this class with a mouse, but a tablet gives you the most natural feel over how you draw with your brushes. You'll find calligraphic brush tips by default at the top of the Brushes panel. They come in these square boxes and they look like the print from a pen tip, circular, oval, or chisel-like. And with my Paintbrush tool selected, I can click on this 8-point oval calligraphic tip and create a path that varies in thickness following the pressure I apply as I draw with my pen tablet. Calligraphic brushes are great for drawing smooth, expressive strokes. And by changing the shape of the tip and the settings, you can set them up to look like an ink brush, a marker, or a chisel-tipped pen that you would use for calligraphy. So before we go any further, I want to give you a little more background on the Brushes panel, and if you've taken my beginning Illustrator class, some of this will be familiar to you. I'll drag my Brushes panel out so we can get a closer look. Like most panels in Illustrator, you'll want to explore the Options menu in the upper right corner of the panel to control what's displayed on the panel. Here you can choose which type of brushes you want visible or hidden from among the different brush types. And I'm going to narrow my selection here to just calligraphic brushes by unchecking the other brush types. This basic line here is just the default stroke for all lines or paths you create in Illustrator, so this basic stroke will always appear on the Brushes panel. And going back to the Options menu, you can choose whether you want a thumbnail view, which is what we have now by default, or you can choose a list view in your panel, and each one has its advantages, but when I'm using calligraphic brushes, I find the list view to be most helpful because it gives you the name of the brush without having to hover for a tooltip. So it's easy to see right away exactly which point size brush tip you're choosing. And there are more options in this menu, but quite a few of them are duplicated in the form of buttons that run along the bottom of the panel. So with the buttons, you can trash a brush you're not using, you can create a new brush, or you can search the library of brushes, or even save your Brushes panel as a library. Now let's take a look at the libraries, and we'll look for calligraphic brushes to experiment with. You can open a library panel by using the button at the bottom of the Brushes panel, and there are so many brushes that are included in Illustrator, which is wonderful, but you won't find a whole lot of calligraphic brushes. And I think this is because they're the easiest to create. Really, the best way to use them is to customize them to the art you're working on and to the way that you like to work. So here's one set here, Artistic Calligraphic. And in the Options menu of the Library panel, I can also get a list view. And just like in the Brushes panel, you can make the type of brushes visible or hidden. So if you can't see anything in the Library panel, it may be because the view is turned off. Okay, and I'm going to lengthen the panel so we can see more brushes. And then just click each brush in the Library panel that you want to add to your Brushes panel. And then in your Brushes panel, you can drag brushes around. You can put them in numerical order and keep them organized. Okay, and now I'll go back to the Libraries menu, and here's another set of calligraphic brushes. This one is called Wacom 6D Art Pen brushes. Now these brushes are specifically for the Wacom Art Pen, which is an extra accessory, a pen that you would buy separately from your tablet. It's just for the Intuos and Cintiq tablets, and it supports barrel rotation in addition to pressure sensitivity and pen tilt. So rotation is an added feature that you get with an art pen. So that's what this set of calligraphic brushes was designed for, and these are great, but we're going to focus mainly on pressure sensitivity in this class. Since that's what most people have, it's standard for bamboo tablets, it's standard for the Intuos and Cintiq tablets, and it's really the most useful setting in Illustrator. And then I'll be mentioning the other settings like tilt and bearing that are standard for Intuos tablets as well. And then here at the bottom of the set are some brushes that could be mistaken for calligraphic brushes because they're contained in a square shape. But these are not just plain circles or ovals or chisels. They look more like a little piece of art. So I'm going to click one to add it to my Brushes panel. And these are actually scatter brushes, so not to be confused with calligraphic brushes. So because we have a list view, we can see that whoever created this brush named it with the word scatter. But if you're ever not sure which type of brush you're looking at, you can double click it once it's in your Brushes panel, and its Options dialog box will appear, and you'll see the type of brush is always named at the top of the dialog box. Okay, so go ahead and add a few of these basic artistic calligraphic brushes to your Brushes panel. And then in the next lesson, we'll introduce the Illustrator drawing tools that we'll be using with these calligraphic brushes, so we can test them out. And we'll go over the basic settings and adjustments that you can make to each of the tools. So meet me in the next lesson. The tools we'll be using to draw with in this class are the Paintbrush and the Blob Brush, which was introduced in CS4. First, we'll take a look at the Paintbrush tool. I'll select the paintbrush and go over to my Brushes panel and click a calligraphic tip to select it, and then draw. The paintbrush takes its color from the stroke color I have set in my color panel. And the paintbrush lays down a path with anchor points as I draw, just like the pencil tool. And here's what the path looks like in outline mode. It's natural and it follows the movements you make with your tablet or mouse. The shortcut for the paintbrush is B, and to set its options, just double-click on the paintbrush in the Tool panel, and the dialog box appears. These tolerance settings for fidelity and smoothness make the paintbrush really versatile. The line I just drew had a fidelity setting of 4 pixels, meaning it was faithful to my movement on the tablet within a tolerance of 4 pixels. And the smoothness is set at 20%, so Illustrator was adding some smoothing to the path as I drew it. Now, if I move the sliders to the absolute lowest settings, the line I draw with the brush tool will most accurately represent my motions on the tablet. So this is as accurate as you can get, but that also means that Illustrator will plot out every wobble you make as you draw, and it adds more anchor points along the path to do this. And you can see all these little anchor points here in outline mode. And I can compare absolute accuracy on the right to some Illustrator added smoothness and a looser fidelity tolerance on the left. So back to my options. I like to adjust these two settings, fidelity and smoothness, depending on what I'm drawing and how much accuracy I need. If I'm tracing something or drawing anything with detail, letters or that sort of thing, my sliders will be closer to the left side and the numbers will be lower. If I want to create very smooth swashes and swirls or script lettering, or if my hand is feeling a little shaky, I'll adjust the numbers higher to draw with fewer anchor points. So we'll revisit these two settings again as we work in this class. And I also suggest working with these checkboxes too. Keep Selected will keep the last line you drew selected, so this can be very convenient. For instance, if I'm drawing lines, trying to get just the right gesture, and this is something I do a lot. You know, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So having Keep Selected checked makes it easy for me to draw and delete quickly. Just hitting the delete key and trying again. And so when you look at a piece of art and you wonder how somebody made it look so effortless, this is probably part of their process too, just over and over again until you find the right line. The other thing I like about the Keep Selected checkbox is that selected lines are ready to edit with the Smooth tool. So let's say you draw a line and it's just about right, and you want to add just a little smoothing, then hold Option or Alt to temporarily switch from the Paintbrush to the Smooth tool, and then run it over your selected path to push it around and smooth it, which is basically removing extra anchor points. That's what the Smooth tool does. Then release Option or Alt and you're back to the paintbrush. So to me, that's two great reasons to use Keep Selected. Now, double-clicking the paintbrush to get its options again, you can leave both boxes unchecked or you can only check the Keep Selected checkbox, and either way, the paintbrush will behave like you would expect a real drawing tool to behave. You can crosshatch and draw lines on top of lines you've just drawn, and it all seems pretty normal. However, the next checkbox, Edit Selected Paths, that's the one you need to be a little wary of, because with this checkbox checked, the paintbrush tool becomes a drawing and editing tool all rolled into one. So I can draw a line, it remains selected because Keep Selected is checked, and then I can even add on to it because Edit Selected Paths is checked too. And this can be really helpful. I can even redraw a line over and over again, just pushing it in the direction I want. It's kind of like the Smooth tool. So there is a benefit here, but this is where it can also become a little hard to control. And if I'm doing something like this, just drawing the petals of a flower one after the other, well, then having both checkboxes checked can be downright annoying because I'm editing old paths instead of drawing new ones. So you have to manage these two checkboxes based on what you're drawing. And generally, I leave the Edit Selected Path box unchecked unless I know I need it. And one other thing, the Edit Selected Paths option has a tolerance setting. So you can decide just how close to the line your paintbrush tool needs to get in order to edit the line. Okay, and going back to the artboard here, the paintbrush tool by default draws open paths, just lines. If you want to draw a closed path and close up a shape with the paintbrush tool, hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt key on a PC while you're drawing, and Illustrator closes the path for you when you release your pen or mouse. And you can even have the shapes you draw take on the fill color you've set in the color panel. To do this, though, you need to go back to the paintbrush options and check Fill New Brush Strokes. But I'm going to leave this unchecked as I normally do. So these are the settings that you can adjust for the paintbrush tool, and actually these are virtually the same for the other natural drawing tools in Illustrator like the pencil tool, the smooth tool, and even the blob brush. So meet me in the next lesson and we'll talk about the blob brush. Now we're going to look at the blob brush. This is a favorite tool of mine. It's great for coloring, and I often use it with transparency and blending modes like we learned about in my Illustrator 2 class, so I can paint with it like I did in this washy cloud illustration. Or I use it to give my work a marker sketch or a marker comp look like I'm doing here. And this was an advertising concept sketch. So it was just a way to preview some of the client's ideas before going to all the trouble of shooting an actual photograph. And I'm just using the Blob Brush here to add color to the sketch. It's a scan of a pencil sketch, so I have the sketch on another layer, and the blending mode of the sketch image is set to multiply so you can see through it. And when I turn the pencil layer off, you can see the blob brush strokes underneath. And in the water here, I even applied a gradient to this shape after the fact. So color sketching in Illustrator with the blob brush is just so great. There's so many things you can do with it. And I do this a lot when I'm working on ideas for a project. I'll do blob brush shading in gray just to very quickly make a little more sense of things in a loose pencil sketch like this. And you can see I have some blob brush work here and even a few pen tool shapes too. So the blob brush is a very useful tool, and you can place any scan of line art or photography on a separate layer. You can change the transparency and work on a layer behind it, just coloring away. So it's a lot of fun to work this way. And just like the paintbrush, the blob brush can be used with calligraphic brushes. So I just grab the blob brush, or I can use the shortcut, which is Shift B, and then select a calligraphic brush and start painting. The color comes from the stroke color you have set in your color panel, just like it does with the paintbrush. The big difference between the paintbrush tool and the blob brush tool is that the blob brush draws expanded brush strokes. So you can see in outline mode the side-by-side comparison here with the paintbrush path on the left and a blob brush path on the right. And we talk about expanding in my classes a lot, but just a quick aside, if you're new to this, you can select a path that you drew with the paintbrush and expand it after the fact by going up to the Object menu and choosing Expand Appearance. And now Illustrator has outlined the appearance of the brush strokes. So we're moving closer to what we have with the blob brush. But in a case like this, with all these overlapping strokes, I'm still left with a lot more complexity than what I have with the blob brush example on the right. So if I want to make this into a nice and simple closed shape, I'll have to take an extra step and unite or merge all of these overlapping shapes. And you can do this with either the Pathfinder panel or the CS5 Shape Builder tool. So I'll get the Shape Builder using the shortcut Shift M, and then holding Shift while I drag a marquee around all the shapes, and now I've merged them. Okay, and I'll switch to outline mode to compare the two, and now they're the same. So it's clear that using the blob brush saves us a few steps. So we can create a freehand shape filled with color like this instantly, and that's why I love this tool. And I went through the expanding and merging process there quickly, just to make that point. But if you're interested in more detail, because expanding and the Pathfinder and Shape Builder tools are larger topics in Illustrator, you'll find we talk more about those things in my beginning Illustrator class. So not only are blob brush paths expanded shapes, but they also will merge with other blob brush strokes of the same color as you draw. So that's yet another reason that the blob brush is a great tool for coloring. And you can see as I work here that the shape of the overall path just gets bigger as my new brush strokes are merging with the original path. And this happens by default when you're painting strokes of the same color with the blob brush. And remember, the blob brush, like the paintbrush, takes its color from the stroke color you have set in the color panel, like this. And that's the rule. But now if you happen to have just a fill color and a stroke of none set in your color panel, and you paint with the blob brush, or the paintbrush for that matter, it will take the fill color. And you can see it just swapped there in the color panel. Now when I select the blob brush stroke I just drew, you can see in the color panel it's now a fill. And that's because, of course, painting with the blob brush results in a filled shape. And I can paint some more, and while the blob brush is active and nothing's selected, then the color panel reads the stroke color. And now if I take that stroke color and swap it with the fill on the color panel, and then I choose a different color for the stroke, and then I draw, the stroke color is the color that you get. and the fill disappears from the color panel. So just be aware of that. Even though we're painting filled shapes with the blob brush, it's still a brush, like the paintbrush tool, in the way that it handles color. And you can, of course, add a stroke to the shape after the fact, but you cannot paint with a fill and a stroke. However, you can even paint with a pattern, which is pretty neat, to be able to paint with polka dots. And you can also merge blob brush strokes with other art of the same color, whether or not it was created with the blob brush. So I've got an object now created with the rectangle tool, and now I'll get the blob brush and draw. And you can see in outline mode, they're merged. Now, one caveat: if you're working on more complex art with a lot of objects, the blob brush will not merge objects that are further down in the stacking order. So, if it involves rearranging the stacking order, the blob brush will not merge the objects. But for the most part, art of the same color will merge with blob brush strokes. And also, strokes of different colors will not merge with the blob brush. And as you can see, these are separate. And just like in the last lesson, you double-click on the blob brush in the tool panel to get its options. And you'll see these familiar fidelity and smoothness tolerance settings here. These are exactly the same as the paintbrush. And then we have two check boxes at the top. Keep Selected is also exactly like the paintbrush tool. And then Merge Only with Selection. This is unique to the blob brush. And in CS4, you'll see the wording is different. It will say Selection Limits Merge, but it means the same thing. Either way, it gives you the option to control that merging behavior that we just looked at. So if you want to stop the default behavior, stop the merging of same colored strokes, then you'll want Keep Selected unchecked and check Merge Only with Selection. And then you can draw blob brush strokes in the same color right on top of each other, and they will not merge into a blob. And you can see that these two blobs are separate. So with this option, the only way to merge strokes of the same color is then to select the path first before coloring, and then they will merge. So that's how to use the Merge Only with Selection checkbox. So you do have control over the merging behavior. But of course, you can always control merging by locking objects or locking layers, so that's always a good way to keep objects discrete. Okay, double-clicking again. So that was Keep Selected unchecked and Merge checked. That's how we control the merging. And I just happen to like the default behavior most of the time, actually, because I'm using the blob brush most often as a coloring or shape drawing tool, and merging is sort of the most natural behavior for coloring. So I usually leave this unchecked. And actually, I like to leave Keep Selected unchecked for the blob brush as well. So I like it checked on the paintbrush and unchecked on the blob brush. And when we get into painting with calligraphic brushes later, I'll explain my reasoning for that. But I often leave both of these boxes unchecked for the blob brush. Then in this area at the bottom of the tool options, you'll see more settings for creating the shape and angle and size of the brush tip you want. But I'm going to skip this for the moment because these options are the same thing as creating a calligraphic brush tip. They're in a slightly different order here, but it's basically the same. So you have the choice when using the blob brush. You can set its size and shape and pressure sensitivity here in the options panel, or you can just click on an already existing calligraphic brush tip in the brushes panel and paint that way. So calligraphic brushes are like having saved settings for the blob brush. So meet me in the next lesson and we'll work with these settings in making calligraphic brushes. We're going to work with the calligraphic brush settings in this lesson, but first take a little time to experiment with the brushes that you selected from the library in Lesson 1. So get the paintbrush or the blob brush, or use the shortcuts, and then go up to the color panel and the swatches panel and set your stroke color. And next, go to your brushes panel and click a calligraphic brush and start drawing. And remember, you can always use the Smooth tool by holding Option or Alt. And if you want to switch to a different tip or try a different color, pay attention to what you have selected, because if you have Keep Selected checked in your paintbrush options, as we talked about in Lesson 2, then you have to remember to deselect the brush stroke before you change to another color or another calligraphic brush. Otherwise, you'll recolor or apply a new brush to the selected stroke. So remember to deselect, and you can just hold Command or Control to temporarily switch to the arrow tool and click the artboard. And experiment. Try out the Blob Brush in the same way. Change its color and change the calligraphic tips as you go. And you'll probably notice the brushes that come with Illustrator could use a little help from pressure sensitivity. They don't offer much finesse in their current state, but we can make adjustments to the brush we're currently using. To start, go to the Brushes panel. The active brush is highlighted in blue in the list view, and if you're using the thumbnail view, you'll just see a double outline around the active brush. So I'll just double click the brush I want to change in the Brushes panel to get its options. And right now I have a 7-point round calligraphic brush. There are just 3 properties I can adjust on a calligraphic brush: the angle, roundness, and diameter. So for this first example, we'll leave angle and roundness where they are and only adjust the diameter. We're going to make this brush pressure sensitive so it responds to the pressure I'm using as I draw on my Wacom tablet. So I'm going to change my diameter to 8 points, and I'll change the fixed option here in the menu to pressure. This drop-down menu enables you to use pressure sensitivity and other options depending on the device you're using, so some of these may or may not work for you. For example, if you're using a mouse, fixed or random are really your only options. If you have a tablet, a Wacom, Bamboo, Intuos, etc., you have pressure capability. And at the moment, I'm using an Intuos 4, but I also use a Bamboo tablet. And my pen on either tablet does not have a stylus wheel, so the stylus wheel option will do nothing for a standard pen like the one I have, so I ignore this. Tilt and bearing are available on Intuos and Cintiq tablets, and I'll bring that up later. But rotation is not available unless you have the extra art pen, as I mentioned in Lesson 1. So these options are all a matter of the tablet you have. However, pressure is really the most important option for natural drawing in Illustrator, and it's a standard feature of Wacom tablets, so Bamboo, Intuos, Cintiq, whichever you have. So once I choose pressure, now I have access to this variation slider here. And I can set the parameters for how much this brush will change with the pressure I exert on my tablet. Because my diameter is 8 points, the maximum variation in diameter I can get from this brush is 8 points. And you can see the strokes I drew with this brush will update on the artboard when you have preview checked. Also, you can see the variation settings showing up in these 3 dots. This indicator reflects all the settings below, and I'll move the variation slider down to 4 points of variation for the diameter, and you can see the indicator updates. And this helps you to visualize the stroke variation you've set. So the center dot represents the 8-point stroke that I'll get from average pressure. And then with the lightest pressure, I'll get a stroke indicated here on the left. That's 4 points. So it's 8 minus 4, leaving you with a 4-point stroke. And then on the right, with the heaviest pressure, I'm adding 4 points, so I can get up to a 12-point stroke if I press really hard on the tablet. So you can see how with this setting, your 8-point stroke weight can vary in either direction by 4 points, depending on the pressure you apply with the pen tablet. So if I slide up to 8 points of diameter variation, you can see the variation is much more dramatic. The average pressure in the center still yields an 8-point stroke. The lightest pressure on the left yields a very fine, almost disappearing stroke of less than a point, and the heaviest pressure on the right yields an additional 8 points, a maximum of a 16-point stroke. So with this setting, I'll see a lot of variation in my line work, and you can see the strokes are previewing on the artboard with this setting. So when I have it where I want it, I just need to give it a new name so that we know it's now an 8-point brush. And then I hit OK, and an alert pops up to ask me if I want to apply this new adjustment to the brush strokes I drew previously with this calligraphic tip. And remember, it used to be 7 points with no pressure sensitivity. So I could overwrite the existing strokes because I'm changing the brush I created them with. So I can choose Apply to Strokes to update the art already on my artboard, or I can hit Leave Strokes to leave things as they are. And so I'm going to click Leave Strokes. And now I'll go ahead and switch colors here. And I can just choose to draw with my altered brush and compare this with what I did before to see if I like what I'm getting with the new pressure sensitivity. I'm drawing with a light touch and then with heavier pressure, and this way I can sort of evaluate how that 8-point variation is working for me. Now, if I want to create a brand new brush from scratch, I just have to go to the Brushes panel and click the New Brush button at the bottom of the panel. And in the pop-up menu, make sure to choose Calligraphic Brush here, and then hit OK. And you're presented with the same options we just worked with. So to alter an existing brush, double-click the brush in the panel. And to start from scratch, use the New Brush button at the bottom of the panel. We'll look at these settings further and create some more brushes, but while we're on the subject of pressure sensitivity, we should also take a look at the setting you can adjust on your Wacom tablet software. So meet me in the next lesson and we'll take a look at that. To get the most out of your calligraphic brushes and the pressure sensitivity settings in Illustrator, you'll definitely want to make adjustments to the Wacom software that runs your tablet. In my case, I have both a Wacom Intuos 4 tablet and a Wacom Bamboo. Both of these tablets have a setting for tip feel that you can adjust by locating the Wacom software on your system. In my case, I'm on a Mac, and I'll just go to the Apple menu, choose System Preferences, and click on the icon for the tablet I currently have connected, in this case the Bamboo. On a PC, the Wacom directions specify that you will click on the Windows Start button and choose All Programs, then select Bamboo or whichever tablet you have, and then choose the Bamboo Properties option. Either way, you should now have the control panel for the tablet visible, and here you'll see the setting for tip feel. It's in the pen menu, and this setting is virtually the same for either the Bamboo or the Intuos. And this is the setting we're focusing on in this lesson, so I'm going to hop back over to my Intuos tablet, and you can follow along with whatever tablet you have. And on this slider, we have a range from soft to firm. And I usually have mine set to the tick mark just to the right of the center, just a little on the firm side, or maybe even a little firmer than that. And that's because I just naturally tend to press hard when I draw, whether I'm drawing with a pen and paper or on the computer. And I'll just leave this setting as is for a while. But then I may start work on a new piece of art with a different brush, and I'll decide I need to come back and make adjustments. And so I like to leave this control panel for the tablet software open while I'm working with calligraphic brushes in Illustrator. That way I can click in the Illustrator window to test out the settings, and then use my Mac keyboard shortcut for cycling through my open programs, and that's Command Tab. And on a PC, the shortcut is Alt Tab. So once I've opened the control panel and then jump back to Illustrator once, from there on I can just hit Command and the Tab key and adjust the Wacom settings, and then go back to Illustrator to test it out. So it's an easy way to go back and forth, just adjusting and testing. And in Illustrator, I've drawn a diagram using the Paintbrush and a calligraphic brush tip to help illustrate the tip feel setting. It might be helpful to think of it like this. You have soft on one side. Picture a real-world brush that's full of paint and almost to the point of dripping. And it would take almost no pressure for you to create a line with that. And on the right, you have firm. And for this, you can picture a very fine, almost dry marker, where you'd have to really press hard to make a clear, dark stroke. And so this is a way to decide how you want your tablet to behave with your pressure-sensitive brushes in Illustrator. Do you want a fully loaded soft brush or a hard marker? And you'll probably want something in between. A lot depends on the way you usually handle your art materials, whether you press hard or you have a light touch. And it also depends on how much variation from thick to thin lines that you want to get from the particular brush you're using in the particular drawing you're working on. A soft feel like that fully loaded brush means you won't have to press hard, but it will give you less variation. So, hopping over to the control panel, I'll move this setting down 1 notch below the center mark, and then I'll test this out in Illustrator. And it's harder to make a wisp of a stroke with a fully loaded brush, so a softer setting can really take something away from that nice variation we set up in the last lesson. I'll just click on that brush again to refresh your memory. So this is that 8-point brush with 8 points of variation. But even when I draw with the lightest pressure, it's not a fine disappearing line as I would like. But I can press hard and it's not difficult at all to get up to that thickest stroke, that 16-point stroke we talked about. And up here at the top I've put some uniform strokes. There's 8 points and 1 point just to help us gauge the thickness as I'm drawing here. So it's easy to get that 16-point stroke without pressing too hard when you have that setting just to the left of the center. Okay, and on the flip side, a firmer setting will allow for finer variation than a soft setting. So I'll go back to the Wacom control panel, that's Command Tab, and now I'll move this setting up to 1 notch above the center. And now in Illustrator you can see with my lightest pressure, I can get a wispy line here that gets nice and thick as I press harder. But up at my 8-point standard here, I'm pressing almost as hard as I can, and I'm not getting much more thickness than this 8 points. And I'm nowhere near this 16-point stroke here I drew with the softer setting. And so you can go back and forth between Illustrator and the tablet software to test it out and find what works for you. But if you really want a very fine stroke from this 8-point brush, you'll probably need to raise the firmness of the pen feel even more. So play around with your settings using the 8-point brush from the last lesson, and then meet me in the next lesson where we'll take another look at the settings for creating calligraphic brushes.